from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we are most pleased to bring to you a program about a book. From time to time we invite an author of a recently published book to review that works. On today's program we have Jerry Dolph, who recently published through Washington State University Publishing a book entitled Fire in the Hole, The Untold Story of Hard Rock Miners. I have a copy of the book here that I'm happy to show you. And it's a very, very exciting work, and it certainly is very interesting to people here in North Idaho and, in fact, throughout the Northwest. Jerry, welcome to the program, and through our conversations, I know that we have learned some very, very important things about the book. I would like to take our viewers through a little bit of that, and we're very pleased to have Steve Schink, our regular panelist, who's the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and he'll ask the first series of questions. But when they sent me a copy of the book and the background, I was impressed that you yourself are writing a book based upon personal experiences. For over 16 years, you worked in hard rock mining in Butte, Montana, and the Silver Valley in North Idaho and other parts of the West. And for our viewers, to make it very interesting to them, I would like to quote a paragraph from your book. I think it illustrates so well your great use of the English language and how it brings to life in the book this very interesting life you've had. I'm quoting from the book when our guest said, "Suddenly we were immersed in the familiar darkness of an underground mine. The squeaking of the train's wheels clicking along tracks and the groaning of the straining cars echoed off the walls. As the bar from the motor rubbed against the trolley line, it gave off static buzzing sounds, showers of sparks, and eerie strobe-like flashes of light. A damp, musty smell surged through the air. Hell, I was home." End of quote. I think that sets the tone and the flavor of your work. Before Steve also starts the questioning, there was some reviews of your book, and one was by a historian at Washington State University, and I thought that it was a great compliment to you and your work when this critique was stated. "A fascinating contemporary social portrait of mining culture in the Pacific Northwest. By the time I finished reading it, I felt as though I had been down some of the shafts. It brings to mind the kind of realities I recall from reading Andy Adams' Log of a Cowboy and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle." Orland Singlen, I believe, was the historian at Washington State University that gave such a good review of the book. Again, welcome to the program, and we look forward to talking to you about the contents. I now yield to Steve Schink.
Jerry, I wonder if you take just a few minutes and take us back before you found a home as a hard rock miner, and tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, where you grew up, and how you came to this area.
Well, the family lived in Casper, Wyoming for some time, and then my father was in construction. We moved from there to Montana, and from there to Wyoming, and back and forth in different towns, and like a boomer family, I believe they call them, moved for the booms and the busts of different towns. And we finally finished up that type of travel when I got out of high school. That's when I joined the Air Force from Oregon. And I went over to Germany for 3 years, and I was there when President Kennedy was assassinated and the Berlin Wall was built. And I came back during this Vietnam War, and I got out of the service. And then I started in construction work. I wound up in Kellogg, and I met my wife. We got married and moved down to Oregon. I went to college trying to major in law enforcement. And I was involved in a high-speed pursuit on the police department there. And I was evidently not driving safely enough, because after that I wasn't working for the police department anymore. And then from there I came up here looking for work in the Kellogg area. And the only thing they had going at the time was a minor entry training program put on by the MDTA, which was to be held in the Kelly mine in Butte, Montana. And that was the same year of the fire at the Sunshine Mine. And I went to work there in June to the school, and the fire was in May of '72. And then while I was in the school, the mine was shut down, and I got out of the school and came back to the valley. and went to work for the Lucky Friday, and I was one of the first people that I quit there after just a month or so, and went over to the Sunshine, and I was one of the first people they hired after the fire. And from there, I just sort of tramped back and forth through the valley all those years. And I made it out of the valley a few times by going to the Homestake mine in South Dakota, and Energy Fuels Nuclear in Fredonia, Arizona, and the Silver Peak, Nevada mine, a 16-to-1 mine for the Sunshine. And then the rest of the mines, the only two that I didn't work in was for the Core and for the Star. And the Star you couldn't get on unless somebody died, because they weren't union, and everybody liked their jobs to stay there, and they're getting good money for it.
Jerry, you told us you got into the mining business through a training program. In those 16 years or so that you worked as a hard rock miner, is there a sort of an apprenticeship program you get through after training? Do you go through a variety of jobs, working from apprentice up to some other position that is at the pinnacle of the mining profession in terms of the actual folks underground doing the work?
It depends on what a person's goals are. Now, when you start off as a miner, most miners start off with a sledgehammer, busting boulders on a grizzly in a mine. Mm-hmm. Like grizzlies, you break them so they'll fall down through 10-inch square holes into a pocket, and then from there the ore is taken out of the mine. But that's where usually, from what I heard, at least that worked with me that way. And the end result is working up in a stope doing the same thing. Now, I don't know how much of an improvement that is, but
and a stope is a
workplace where the miners break rock. And in the mine, the parts of a mine, like the tunnel or the drift, is named after the body parts of a snake. The back is the ceiling, the sides are the ribs, the part where you're drilling is called the face, and the back end of the drift or tunnel is called a tail drift. And usually that's where the miners start working, is just by doing menial type jobs and working their way up into the stope or the work areas.
Do you work in small groups? Are there specialized operations going on at different places at different times? How's the work organized underground?
They drive a drift, a tunnel, paralleling the ore body, because if they put it in the ore body, the ground is so crumbly that it'll always collapse, and it's really hard to maintain. Once they parallel this ore body, they drive cross drifts off, and they intersect the ore vein. Then they drive raises, they raise up. And that's where the miners work, in the stopes, and they use gravity feed. You shoot the rock, you scrape it with a slusher bucket, and it falls down a chute, and then they take the ore out to this pocket, and then when you get it all mucked out, they build a sand wall, and you pour it full of sand, and you work on top of the sand for the next level, and that's the way that usually works. And the stope is, there's a vein of ore. They might have a really long vein of ore, and they'll have the stopes end to end, and are just long enough to be convenient to work. They try to use an arch type system. That way the ground tries to, like a tunnel, it tries to support itself. And in 1969 at the Lucky Friday, they didn't do that. They just shot them all at once, and they had a horrendous air blast, 3.9 on a Richter scale. And the whole stope just disappeared all at once. And after that, they tried to use the arch system. And it works really well.
Of the various jobs that you've had over the years as a miner, is there one that you particularly enjoyed and one that you particularly didn't?
Making money is what part I liked.
Payday was
really
your favorite part of the job?
I think that was probably true with the people I knew. I'm sure there was some people who loved it for the mining itself, but the people I knew just liked it on payday. And then that was exceptionally the good part of the job.
Jerry, we introduced the program as about your book, Fire in the Hole, and I want to take you back a little bit and get us into the book, and then during my term on this particular series, we're going to show some photographs in a few minutes. But I was reading and preparing for the program, and I noticed that at a very young age your father influenced you about what you should do with your life and about writing. Tell us that story and get us into the hard rock mining, and then I will get us introduced into the book. You didn't start out with an idea as a young man from what your father said to you to be a writer, did you?
No, I was dissuaded to stay away from writing and drawing and things because I was not really being very productive. And he was a hard-working man, And he figured, by golly, you get out and you earn your money, and to do that you work your tail end off to make money for your family. And I guess he decided that I wasn't doing it the way he did, which is good for him, I suppose. I was I didn't do very much writing after that, and I didn't really do much reading after that until I was hurt in '88, and I hadn't read any newspapers or anything, and then I just started writing, and that's when I started writing the book.
But I was so intrigued when he said something about, why don't you quit dealing with this interest in writing and so forth and go out and make a living?
Yeah,
so
make something out of yourself, yeah.
So it postponed this particular part of your life for a long time.
Yeah.
Do you suppose that even with this, obviously, not only desire you had to write, but it's illustrated by the quote that I gave and others, that you have a gift for writing. But if you had not been injured and continued to work until retirement, do you think that there was the same chance that you would have gotten into writing these books later in life, or would it pass possibly?
I don't know as it would ever have happened. They say that the good Lord puts somebody in a certain place at a certain time, and I believe strongly in that. I was sitting at one of the last parts of my mining experiences. There was an open chute, 4 foot in diameter, tube run down about 180 feet. I was sitting there with my feet, or legs dangling down into this hole. And you get into the rat race of going back and forth to work and making all these thousands of dollar stacks of 20s that deep at every payday, just really great, but it's like a rat race. And I was sitting there thinking, I wonder what would happen if I just sort of pushed off, and I started hallucinating. Maybe it was a powder gas, but I started hallucinating hearing screaming coming up from that hole. So I never did. And that made a big influence on me right there. I decided that I wanted to do something productive, and perhaps that's what led me into writing. So
now we've arrived, you had your injury and you had the time, and you, from your resume, you've done some other writing and so forth. I know another book is in the planning stages. But for the viewer who wants to read this book, Fire in the Hole, take a moment to go through the table of contents. What is the book? I know it's about hard rock mining, but what is the theme and what's the structure?
Well, I don't really like the term hard rock mining so much. This is a people story. It's a story of the man's everyday experiences. Like the fellow that was walking along in a drift and the rock burst, explained, the whole wall just collapses all at once. Well, he was walking by this wall and it collapsed down on top of him, and he was instantly buried with all this gravel, and he couldn't move. And coincidentally, one of his other people working on the level was walking back out toward the shaft just after that. And he happened to look down and see the yellow of a hard hat sticking out of the muck pile. And he reached down in there and he pulled his hard hat off. Now, this fellow was laying there with all this weight on him. He couldn't yell. He was starting to black out. He couldn't say anything. All he could do was lay there with his eyes open. And when that fellow pulled his hard hat off of his head, this guy was staring up at him. He didn't expect to see his face under that hard hat. And he screamed like somebody's little girl would have. And he was really embarrassed about that after that. But this is a people story of things that happened instead of how big or how high. Don't do that.
So the whole book it's from a very human perspective of here's the kind of life it is. It's a hard life, and here's the kind of things that happen to people.
Sure. I wanted to introduce the reader or non-miners, people who haven't been in the mine. The Sunshine was good enough to loan me sketches of mining techniques and that sort of thing. And without dwelling on the technicalities of something, I put them in the book in that perspective so that the reader would be able to just scan that one page and see how it's done, and then go on to there with more stories.
I noticed in going through the book that there's a lot of narrative, and then there's a lot of photographs that illustrate. And it's what you're talking about right now. If you look at, if I can just hold this up a little bit, here's an example of a book page where you have photographs of miners in the story. And I believe there's about 13 chapters in the whole process. Mm-hmm. With only 30 minutes, it's hard to get through all the content of the book. But what we're going to do now is ask our staff to put some photographs up on the screen and have you take us through those, because that's part of the book, not only visually, but the stories behind them. And here's the first photograph.
Okay, this is a number 2 shaft at the Lucky Freddy. The man standing there with the gate is Carl Curl, and he was, I believe he's retired now, but he was a skip tender. And what he does is he helps load the skip. He works with the hoistman. There's a bell cord hanging down by the timber, and you pull on the cord 3 times for up and 2 for down and 1 for stop. And by doing that, the skip, there's 3 decks on it. It comes down from the top. You load the bottom deck, and then you lower it down. And anyhow, you load the skip up, and he's just in the process of closing the gate and belling the hoistman to go ahead and lower the skip down the shaft.
Mm-hmm. Well, in doing all that too, it's that kind of visual aids that are in the book, and we hear some people are visual learners and some are audio learners, or of course reading the language is also visual. We're going to get another photograph up on the screen here in just a second. We'll let you take us through another shot here.
This man is Bear Hunter, and he was a supervisor at the Lucky Friday at Hecla. And what happened here is this is the round that you drill. Those holes are drill holes, 6 foot deep, I would assume, and they're loaded with high explosives. Those wires or cords hanging out of there are primer cords. In the very end stick, it goes all the way to the end of the hole. And on the end, there's a spitter cord that's on fire. And he lit it from the bottom. And on the end of each one of those primer cords, there's what they call an igniter. And when the spitter cord burns up to that igniter, it sets it off. So that hole goes off. And then that spitter cord keeps going up and it sets off the next igniter. And then that hole goes off. And that way they time the round so that they know which hole is going to go off, and it works really well. And that's what he's doing there. And pretty quick he'll be leaving the round and then going up the shaft.
When you do that particular topic, says how many holes would you set off at the same time within?
It depends on the round. Some ground was so bad, not specifically at the Lucky Friday, but at all the mines. It's really rotten, crumbly. You can hit it with a bar and just fall out. I mean, you drill a hole and it maybe put 1 stick of powder in it and it'll blow down the whole end, and it might. I've shot around 30 feet wide with 2 sticks of powder once.
So it depends on where you are. Here's our next photograph.
This is a photograph I got from the library in Kellogg. They have the Bunker Hill pictures there, and this is 1880s, 1890s. The machine standing above the man on the right there, over his head, that's the old predecessor to the modern day jackleg. And it doesn't have any water hose hooked to it. It's called a wiggle tail. There's a track, and you crank this into the hole, up into the hole, because there's no hydraulic leg to push it into the hole. And this is immediately after the drill steel, hand steel, where you pound on it 50 beats a minute on, trying to drill a hole by hand. And what this caused, with no air or no water to wash the drillings out of the hole and cut down the dust, there's an awful lot of silicate in the ground, and they get what they call silicosis. This tiny little barbs of rock get in your lungs, and it coats your lungs so you can't breathe, and they call it miner's lung. And it lasts about 3 months, and a person would die. Not all the time, of course, but that's pretty good standard.
And so you have to use certain mechanisms to try to prevent that happening.
Mine Safety and Health Administration, the Bureau of Mines, they have real stringent rules on you have to make sure that everything's wetted down really well to keep the dust down because of that. In coal mining, you call it black lung. Mm-hmm. But in hard rock mining, of course, it's called miner's lung. So
we can also have that in highway construction where there's a lot of drilling and that same kind of problem. Here's our next photograph.
This is an interesting picture. This came from Kellogg Public Library, and that is a motorman pulling muck out of a chute, and those are ore cars that he's dumping them into. And once one's full, he'll move the train ahead a little bit till he gets to the next empty car, and then fill that car, and so on until the end of the train. And he goes out, dumps the train, comes back in, and does it again until the chute's empty. One time at the Bunker Hill, they had a chute that was hung up in my stope, and I couldn't get the rock to fall through the chute. So I took a 10-foot piece of wooden powder pole and strapped 2 sticks of dynamite on the end of it and shoved it up in there and shot it off with electric primer. Nothing happened. I put 2 sticks together and then finally 3, and I still couldn't get it down. So then I had to do is climb up the chute to try to figure out what was wrong. And I climbed up there about 30 feet, and there was nothing holding it there. It was just on a slant. So when I finally wedged my little 4-foot-long piece of powder pole in there with the primer I'd taken up there, or the wire I'd taken up there with me, And when I finally got down to the bottom, the motorman had closed the gate so that all these little fines had filled the gate up. And I yelled at him to open the gate, and I heard a rumbling sound. I thought, well, hey, that couldn't be coming just from that little bit of muck. And it just scared me to death. And I jumped and landed on the wear plate on the bottom of the chute and slid out under the upheld gate. He slammed the gate right after I went through it, and I landed on my back in the empty muck car. And the oar hit the gate right behind me. So that was close. I didn't climb any more chutes.
It's a really dangerous occupation, and I think those photographs, what you're saying, really illustrates some of the kind of stories that are in the book. We shall return to Steve Shink.
Jerry, I don't want to bring back unpleasant memories, but we were just talking about the dangers of mining, and you're a writer now because of a mine injury. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Well, I was working in the Lucky Friday, and I don't want to take anything away from Hecla Lucky Friday. They have a really great safety program. They have really, really good procedures there. But I injured my left knee, and what happened was I had what they call a torn medial meniscus, and it had to put a steel plate in my left leg, bend the leg back so that what little bit of cartilage I did have left in my leg would articulate so it'd be more centered. And it left me without being able to work anymore. I can't sit in a chair very long, and I think things just graduated into my back and other joints. And I can't stand very long, and I guess it's just part of mining. But
what is it then? I mean, did you think about other possible new occupations? You weren't going to be a hard rock miner anymore. We know from one of your earlier tales that writing was something you enjoyed as a young man. Was that automatically your choice of what you wanted to do from that point on, or did you kick around the idea of some other kinds of work?
I used to call the employment office hotline every day, 2 or 3 times a day, see if there's anything I could do. And I did that for a long, long time. And I couldn't find anything I could do without being a sedentary type of a job. And I couldn't sit through school long enough to learn anything, to do anything. And then the only thing left to me was what I'm doing, is writing. Actually, it's more of a natural type progression.
What was the transition difficult for you?
Not really, amazingly enough. I really enjoyed the challenge, and I worked with a little word processor in the writing of the first book, and it was really difficult. And it was a good little machine, but it's really time-consuming and things. So I asked Coeur d'Alene Mines if they had an old computer they would give me, and by golly, they gave me one. And that's what I use now for my writing. And that was really, really nice of them, I thought.
Do you have some, I mean, the title of your book is Fire in the Hole, the Untold Story of Hard Rock Miners. As you were writing the book, did you reflect at all on why it is maybe that especially in this area where mining is such a strong part of our past, that more hasn't been done to tell the story of miners?
I can't really answer that. It's just that it's something that just hasn't been done. I feel that it's a real definite need for that. Every once in a while you see in the paper where, I was talking to a lady the other day, her father-in-law was a miner, but he passed away in '88, and you always hear things like that. Well, he died, and I mean, I felt that was a real shame. Those stories need to be preserved. The book is made up my own experiences and a lot of the folks I worked with. And as far as I understand, this is the only time this has ever been done from the valley. And the story of for instance, the story of the Sunshine Mine disaster. There's an hour-by-hour account in the back of the book, and a memorial to the people involved in the fire, and a photograph of the memorial. I tried to do it a real in-depth type thing. But I don't know why more hasn't been written, other than just nobody was interested in it, I would assume.
When you started on this book, did you kind of announce your intention to people that you knew, or was it one of those things where you said, maybe I better keep this to myself until I find out whether or not I can do it?
Well, I was like every other writer trying to get started. I went to the Valley Boys in Wallace and asked them if they'd be interested in an article, and Becca Ray was editor then, and she said, well, yes. She printed one, and from there I graduated. I started writing for weekly column for the Silver Valley Sun in Wallace, and they had to go under, so I went over to the Show News Press, and I wrote for them for about 8 months or so in a Wallace Miner, weekly columns. And then I came over to the Post Falls Tribune and wrote for them. But I was always trying to get out of the immediate area, the Coeur d'Alene, Silver Valley area with my writing, because that's the job of any writer, is to try to get as well known as possible. I called Ira Nelson one time. He's the editor of the Palouse Journal in Moscow, and I think they've changed their name now. But I asked him, what would you do? And he says, well, we'll try trade journals. And that's what I did. I started with the International California Mining Journal, and I've been published in Rock and Gem several times, and mining engineering and trade journal type publications, and it's worked out quite well.
Wonderful. Did you get a lot of encouragement from your friends in the mining business?
I won't go that far. I think that the mining companies they have to be real careful of the material that comes out of the mine. And I can see that. It's fair. I try real hard not to slant my writings either way, too. But
what about the other miners you worked with, though? Are they pleased to see the story of what they do told finally?
I think they're flattered, yeah. It's the Silver Valley, they had the Steelworkers Union. You have all these thousands of people coming through there, and that's what it was. Well, the mines all had, in the 70s, they all had 3 crews. They had one hiring out, one working, and one quitting. And that's just a steady turmoil of people. And I felt that, by golly, that needed to be preserved, that history. So
we're just about out of time. We have less than 2 minutes. But one of the things I'm sure that you've learned from this whole process of working and writing is, again, a hard life. What does it do to people and their thinking? Are they fatalistic about life? And the miners I've met, like any other occupation, they look at life different than some other occupations.
You enjoy life more when you know it may not be there. You work around someone who gets killed, and there's just no comparison with the way you feel before and after. A lot of the times you take things for granted, like the sun coming up or whatever, somebody yelling at you, but after that you enjoy those things. And I really do. Every day I get up, I think, hey, there's another day, you know. And I work with a lot of people who aren't here anymore, so.
So you live more immediate rather than for the future?
I think so. I always have, ever since I started working in the mines. I didn't ever figure I was going to be alive long enough to retire from the mines anyhow, so I think I still kept that same line of thinking.
On that note, on behalf of Steve Schenck and our staff, Jerry Dolph, we thank you so much for spending this time with us. You were very good to come by, and good luck with this publication and with your future publications. And again, I would repeat that Fire in the Hole is available through the Washington State University Press, and I know that you have found this program very interesting, and I invite you to be with us, ladies and gentlemen, again next week at this same time when we will discuss yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.